It had been a long night, and Robin was tired as he stood at his DJ booth. But there was really no other place he'd rather be, especially not in Grangemouth, where the only future most kids saw for themselves was working long days in a factory. But maybe if he put on his music, the music that he loved, people would stop dancing like they normally did when he played what he wanted, and he could go home. So he put on the somber, dark music of the birthday party and watched as one by one they all left the dance floor, except for the strange girl in fishnets and short hair. She stayed, dancing alone to the birthday party as if it was Duran Duran. There was something about her, something enthralling. Maybe she was the key to leaving all of this behind and starting a brand new life. This is the story of the Cocteau Twins. If you end up enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like, and if you want to join me as I'm trying my best to learn as much as I can about music history and sharing some of those stories with you, feel free to subscribe. It's free to do. You can always unsubscribe if it's not really your thing. I also want to give a huge shout out to our newest member, Piglos. Thank you so much for wanting to contribute to what I'm trying to do here with this channel. It means a lot that you want to partner with me on that. Piglos is going to get earlier access to the videos. They're going to get access to members-only polls where I ask what people want to hear me talk about next, and then some members only content that I've started trying to roll out a little bit. If that sounds interesting and worth it to you, there's a link in the description below where you can sign up as well. Also, before we get started, there's a lot of quotes in this one, and I know some people in the past haven't loved that. Not sure why, but I figured, what was the point trying to summarize a quote when the quote did a really good job of making the point for me? So I figured I would just throw the quotes in there. So if you don't like me reading quotes, maybe this one's not for you. Robin Guthrie was born in a smaller riverside industrial town in Scotland called Grangemouth. I've also heard it pronounced Grangemouth, but Grangemouth just kind of makes more sense to me, so that's what I'm going to be going with. I'm sorry if that is incorrect, but he was born there in 1962. Robin explained that this town that was really focused on the oil industry was almost halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow, in a mix of those kinds of cultures. Though there were musical instruments around his house when he was growing up, he never took any formal lessons. Instead, he was way more into electronics, explaining, "I was into fuzz boxes and pedals and things like that, and I ended up putting them into my guitar." By the time he was 16, he was already playing guitar a little bit, but he had a lot of friends who were really into Led Zeppelin and were trying to mimic that kind of technical guitar playing, and he knew he could never really measure up to that. So when he was 16, he decided to try something different. He decided to combine his love of playing the guitar with his love of electronics to create a new kind of sound. He said, "I was just young and really enthused by the idea of using all these effects and making the guitar sound like something different. You know, if I can't stand out from all my friends by the way that I play, I'll stand out by the way that I sound. I couldn't play as well as them, but none of them could sound like me." And later on, he described his process of guitar playing and the sound he was going for by saying, "I mean, a bit of distortion, a bit of chorus, a bit of delay, that's mostly it. All done with care and with my taste. There are infinite possibilities with all the gear out there. Like I said, it's subjective, like cooking, right?" He got into music right before the punk rock explosion, so he was listening to a lot of R&B when he was growing up. But then punk happened, and it shook everything up, both in the music industry and in his personal taste. He said that he was too young for really that initial punk explosion in the mid to late 70s, but he did sneak in to see Generation X when he was 14, sneaking in through the bathroom. Soon after that, he started a punk band called The Heat with his childhood friend Will Heggie that he said played songs of the moment. But he also said that pretty quickly they grew a little bit tired of that and kind of lost interest in music for a bit, but they bought a drum machine together, and that was an expensive piece of equipment, so they figured they'd better do something with it. That's how the two of them started a new group, and they took that punk ethos of we can do whatever we want into making this new kind of music with the drum machine. Will Heggie was from the same town as Robin, and the two boys were good friends since childhood. Robin described them both as geeky and into electronics, and after the Heat broke up, the two of them released a single under the name The Liberators, but that group also wasn't really going anywhere. There's a little bit of different narratives around this next part, so I'm going to tell this first part of the story and then tell the alternate version in a little bit, so bear with me before you leave a comment. In one interview, Robin said that the two of them alone made a demo tape in his mom's house, and since they didn't know how to actually copy from cassette to cassette, they just made two demo tapes by performing the song twice, and then they took those demo tapes and sent one to John Peel and one to a record label called 4AD that they both really loved, since 4AD had bands like The Birthday Party on it. But the two of them always knew that the band was missing something. They needed an added element, preferably a singer. They knew who Elizabeth Fraser was. They'd seen her around. It was a small town, so even though she was a couple years younger than them, they'd known her from school. But then Robin started seeing her at some of the punk clubs, and he was a DJ at one of those clubs. So whenever he played the music that he wanted to play, she was one of the few people who actually stayed on the dance floor. So the two of them struck up a friendship, and he thought she might want to join the band. There was just something about her that screamed artistic, that he just kind of knew she could sing even before he had ever heard her. Since she, like so many other teenagers in their town, had so little interesting prospects for a career or a future, she figured, why not give this a try? And I saw in so many different places, so many different interviews and stories, people describing this town as kind of a feeling of hopelessness. It was an industrial town. There really wasn't much going on for these kids to latch onto. Elizabeth described it as Grangemouth is not exactly a hive of social activity. The only excitement for a 30-mile radius is the Nash, a local hotel disco where Rob was DJ. That's where we all met, although Rob and Will had been in bands together before. Elizabeth Fraser, of course, was from that same industrial town in Scotland as the boys, but she was born in 1963. In explaining how few options women in particular had in that town, she talked about her parents and said, most of the women worked where my mother did, in a sewing factory called Rax, and most of the men worked for BP, but my father was a tool grinder in a wood yard. She has mentioned before, and it's been kind of a prominent part of her story and her upbringing, that growing up she was a victim of incest, but couldn't find too many particular details about that, and I don't know that I would share them even if I could. It's more of her story to tell, but I do think it shaped who she was in her kind of expression and the music that she enjoyed and put out. So I think it's worth mentioning, even if I'm not going to go into details about it. She mentioned that one of the ways that it really impacted her was when they started releasing music and people started calling it music to make love to. And that just sounded so weird to her. She said, I've had so many hangups about sex all my life because of the incest and everything. I've only just started having it. When I first heard comments like music to make babies to, it freaked me out. It was too grown up. With that, she seemed to have had a very difficult upbringing, with one magazine saying she also suffered from bulimia, and she left her parents' house when she was 16 because they weren't a fan of her punk sensibilities and aesthetic. She described herself as the sweetest punk. She was kind of left out at school because she had a shaved head and fishnets and kept to herself. She was also incredibly self-conscious and shy, refusing to give interviews until well after they were famous. I say refusing, she was just reluctant to give interviews. She still gave some. When she first joined the group, it didn't start off all that well. She was too nervous to sing in front of Will, and she couldn't really wrap her mind around the lyrics, so she quit pretty quickly. But then a few months later, after she started dating Robin, she figured he's going to be doing this band thing anyway, I might as well rejoin. The trio also had this very dry, Scottish, wry sense of humor, with Will saying that the only reason they invited Liz into the band was because she was the only one at the club who could actually dance, and they didn't actually like her all that much, but that's why they brought her in, and it's undoubtedly a joke. Then 4AD called them, that label that they really enjoyed, that they sent their demo tape to. And the label enjoyed the demo tape. And Robin said that they were really pleasantly surprised when they discovered that the band now had a female singer. That was like an added element that was really interesting to them. They also started calling themselves the Cocteau Twins, taken from a song by Simple Minds. Or, as their website puts it better, quote, Robin Guthrie and Will Heggie got the name from an early version of a song by fellow Scots Simple Mind entitled Cocteau Twins, that was later renamed to No Cure. The song is rumored to have been about two men in Glasgow, Scotland, who had a reputation for being pretentious film snobs with a fondness for the work of Jean Cocteau. And this is where there's kind of two different narratives that emerged about how they ended up on 4AD. I've already said the first one, where Robin said that they recorded a demo before Liz sent that to 4AD, that whole thing. But now this is the one that's most commonly out there, the one that most people, I think, believe and could very well be true. And that's that with Liz in the band, they recorded a demo and then they went to a birthday party gig. And Robin, with a lot of gumption and naivety, decided, I'm just going to go backstage. So he dragged Will and Liz along with them backstage. They went and they met Phil Calvert, who was the drummer of the birthday party. Phil was very nice and generous to them, and he gave them the address of 4AD. So they took a trip down to London, went to 4AD, and hand-delivered the demo. And instead of it being like there was no female lead singer on the demo, so they were surprised to learn there was, the other story is that the music was just so loud on that demo tape that they couldn't hear Liz. So it was kind of like a surprise, like, oh, that's the singer kind of thing, more than she wasn't there. That's the other story. That's the most popular one you're going to hear out there. Also, before everything really got started, they did have another singer for a little bit, one of Liz's friends named Carol, but she left pretty quickly. And I also heard that they actually had a drummer for a bit. Once he asked them to reimburse some of his travel expenses, they decided the drum machine was probably good enough and just went with that. Robin credits everything that happened next with this early stage of the band to their sheer naivety. They didn't know that these things didn't happen. They figured, of course, 4AD would want to cut a record with them. They made good music. They didn't know enough to be surprised at their good fortune when Ivo Watts Russell, the head of 4AD, called them and asked if they wanted to make a record. But they did make that record, and they released their debut album, Garlands, in 1982. And I've heard it said that it sent shockwaves through the indie music circuit. Robin described the type of sound he was after with the band during this period, saying, "Recently, I found some cassette tapes of our early rehearsals. What is really interesting is that we sounded the same from day one. I wanted that big sound. I suppose I was steering the band toward the sounds we had, and Will Heggie was also a big part, putting his bass through delay pedals. Though he wasn't yet the producer on this album, like Robin eventually would be, Robin's ideas still carried a lot of weight in the studio, to the point where the engineers were getting a bit fed up with him and him trying to take control. They spent only 7 days making the album in Scotland. The band was still very young, Liz was only 17, but that album was seen as the antithesis to the overindulged pop music of the early 80s, with bands like Duran Duran. So it hit the indie charts really well. It was the perfect taste of what the band could be. But that version of the band wasn't fated to last all that long. Robin and Liz were tired of taking the train down to London, where their studio was, where they could get better gigs. So they wanted to just relocate down to London, but Will wasn't wanting to do that, so he left the band. Of course, that's only one narrative. There are several others, depending on who you ask and what story you listen to. I've also seen it said that Will was just kind of getting fed up with the band. He wasn't clicking as well with Liz in particular, but also Robin anymore. So he was just sick of it all and wanted to leave. They haven't really been forthcoming about the real reason why he left, so that's kind of up to speculation. But that train and relocating to London story is something that Robin has said in an interview. Will ended up forming a band called Lowlife, which was managed by Robin's brother. Apparently, he did remain friends with Robin and Liz after he left the group. Lowlife broke up in 1997, and Will seems to have retired from music, slipping into a more private life. According to a random Reddit comment that you probably should not trust or believe, they said that he started working for the oil industry and he spent time just with his wife and kids being kind of a normal person. So with Garlands hitting the industry and sending these shockwaves, as one article put it from the time, Cocteau Twins could be seen as this like Cinderella story. They seemingly sprung from nowhere with no media attention or no forewarning that they were coming, and with one hastily made album, they captured the indie national attention. Rob explained, "We just couldn't understand it. We got hardly any reaction from the press, and still the album kept selling." I mentioned that they wanted to relocate to London after the release of Garlands, and one of the reasons for that was because of the culture of the area they were in Scotland. Robin explained that since they were almost, not exactly, but almost equidistant between Glasgow and Edinburgh, those two towns, though they seem to be pretty close on a map, are very different culturally. Wow. So whenever they would try and play gigs in Glasgow, the people in Glasgow thought they were an Edinburgh band and didn't want to bring them in. People in Edinburgh thought they were a Glasgow band and didn't want to bring them in. So they were just kind of caught in the middle of these two different cultures. So in London, they were getting to open for the birthday party and play these much more exciting gigs and shows, so it just seemed like a better fit for where they were at in their career at that point. Like right around the time Garlands was coming out, they gave some interviews where they talked about just feeling so disconnected from the London scene, which at the time they hinted at being a good thing because it meant that they could do exactly what they wanted without that influence, but could also feel them just getting a little bit left out, and they were like, we kind of need to be in London to really make a go of this. Despite all of this new attention, they weren't happy with Garlands. So much of it didn't sound how they wanted. The professional engineers and producers wouldn't let them feed the drum machine through a fuzz box like they did at their live shows, so the drums in particular came out sounding way too clean for what they wanted. And it annoyed some fans in the future how much Rob tended to insult his work with the Twins, but he explained it was a typical Scottish attitude to be self-deprecating. And really, he was proud of the music they made, but he said whenever he listened to Cocteau Twins albums, the only thing he could think about is what he would have done differently, so it was hard for him to appreciate and enjoy the albums as much. In 1983, they released their second album, Head Over Heels, that saw them rocket to much larger popularity. John Peel loved that album and would play it in its entirety on his radio show. Rob explained that this one was way more of like a love song-centric album, but some critics thought those love song lyrics were pretty vapid and stupid. Luckily, Liz's voice was so dreamy and beautiful that it kind of obscured the lyrics, and that's a running theme that you're going to hear a lot if you dig into the Cocteau Twins, and it's the idea that the lyrics just kind of make no sense a lot of the times. They're just kind of random, and it's like the lyrics don't match up with the music because the music's this beautiful, dreamy thing, and the lyrics are just like, what is happening here? So Liz kind of explained why that is the case. She said that when she was writing lyrics a lot of the times, she would look at a dictionary or look at a book in a foreign language that she didn't understand and just pick out words that looked interesting to her, even though she had no idea what they meant, and she would put those into the songs. So the words themselves didn't have their inherent meaning. The meaning was given in how she sang it and how it fit with the music. So it can sound like it's just random, but there was at least a little bit of method to that madness. They spent most of the time between Garlands releasing and working on the second album on tour, which was a really grueling process, and they left that tour feeling like they wouldn't mind never doing another tour. And it was actually in the middle of a tour that Will decided to leave, but that meant that a lot of that second album needed to be written in the studio. Plus, the writing was different with just the two of them. Rob explained, Head Over Heels is like a new start in many ways. While still having faith in the new album, we still believe that we can make something much greater. This time, I have had to rely upon my own judgment in writing the songs, whereas in the past, Will and myself would write together. We used to be able to fall back on each other, so this time it was completely different. In 1984, after some gigs in the United States, they expanded the band back into a trio, adding Simon Raymond. Simon was from London, and he had been bouncing around the post-punk circuit, starting with a stint in a band called Drowning Craze. He actually worked in the record store of Beggar's Banquet, which was like basement of 4AD. 4AD was over the Beggar's Banquet record store, so he was familiar with the Twins, and he met him through that. Over the next couple of years, while trying to figure out how they best worked as a trio and where they wanted to push their sound, the band released a few EPs and two new albums called Treasure and Victoria Land, which Victoria Land peaked at number 10, so they were gaining a lot more popularity. Slowly, they were asserting themselves as one of the best and most dominant indie acts in the UK. By this point, Robin was producing the band's music and was finally able to input his designs more fully. The music took on a kind of dreamlike quality. A review in Enemy said it echoed with sounds of the distant and exotic, but they also started to get annoyed with the whole process of the music industry. They joked that people would say their music is indescribable and then go ahead and try to describe it. Rob then added, kind of tongue-in-cheek, it's not even for listening to. If you read all the reviews and stuff, the records are made specifically for knobbing. Which was obviously a reference to what critics had been saying, but the critics weren't saying that negatively. They were actually pretty well received within the larger music industry. They didn't give the best interviews. They were kind of famous for being this tough interview band. Liz had come out of her shell a little bit, but she was still pretty shy and nervous in interviews, and they just had this attitude, almost this like, we're better than this whole industry, we don't need to be doing this kind of attitude to them. Liz looked back on that attitude at that time and said it was still inspired by punk rock, for better or worse, and she kind of regretted it. She said, we're still paying for that, you know what I mean? Apart from the clothes, we're still pretty punk by our attitude, which hasn't brought us anything. Sometimes I wish we weren't like this. I don't know why that's still the case. It's so damaging to everything we do. Everyone was just cacking their pants at the thought of success. I don't know, I can't understand it. By 1988, they had rode their commercial success to a major label distribution deal with Columbia in the US, which opened the doors to a different market for them. As they rolled into the 90s, they were poised to be one of the biggest bands in the rock world. And at least commercially, that seemed to be happening. They released an album in 1990 called Heaven or Las Vegas, which was their highest charting album in the UK, hitting number 7. It didn't fully break in the US, but none of their albums ever really got all that successful in the US. The single Heaven or Las Vegas might have been the most commercially accessible single that they ever released, so that helped the album have a lot more life than their past ones. Heading into the 90s, they seemed determined to bring shoegaze and the style of dream pop into the mainstream. But behind the scenes, the backbone of the group, which was that relationship between Rob and Liz, was breaking down. Of course, they were experiencing the normal ups and downs of a relationship that spans over a decade, but being in a band and working that closely together every single day added another level of tension. They had a daughter in 1989, which Liz said did not help repair their relationship like she hoped. She mentioned that she could tell she was losing Robin, and she thought that having a baby might help fix what was broken. But as so many people before her and after her have discovered, that didn't work. Liz started to feel less at home in the band, and she started trying to distance herself and break away from it a little bit, which, according to some people, you can see reflected in the lyrics to the band's next album, Four Calendar Cafe, released in 1993. For that album, they also switched to a major label called Fontana, leaving 4AD for the first time, which shocked a lot of fans because to them, Cocteau Twins just were 4AD. Like, they were kind of synonymous. But Liz was also really good at hiding her struggles during this period, so her friends didn't know things were wrong, which just made her feel more isolated and alone. For his part, Rob turned to drugs and alcohol to cope with the attention on the band and the strain on his relationship. I saw someplace that he started taking cocaine in 1988, and it quickly spiraled out of control. While they were working on the Four Calendar Cafe album, the band's manager convinced him to go to rehab, which got him clean, but it also made him less focused in his mind. He said, "It made me take my eye off the ball a little bit when it came to being in control of what was happening. We had a particular way that we worked, but everybody was trying to work the machine differently, and I was just like, oh yeah, you want to try something different? Go ahead." And that ended up with those two EPs, Twilights and Otherness, which for me seemed to lack most of the essence of Cocteau Twins. Quite honestly, I'm a little embarrassed by those records that they say Cocteau Twins on them. I think it all worked really well when I was a more single-minded producer and less so when I wasn't. That was a very dark period for the band. Liz explained how they were all losing themselves to various addictions and codependencies, saying, "We were all living a lie. The three of us were addicted to each other. Robin had his drugs and alcohol, and I had Robin, and Simon too. And we were just so sick with no sense of self. That was a very frightening time because I thought Robin was going to die. And I thought, if he dies, I'm going to die because I can't live without him." By 1994, their relationship had ended, but they were still under contracts, so they just kept working on another album. Liz said for the recording after they broke up, she'd just come in at the end after the music was already done and try to leave her mark on the record. That was really tough to do because it sounded so full already. There was no room for her to put herself into it as well. In the future, she would say that she regretted sticking around and still carrying on with the band despite the breakup, but she did hang on to make one more album, Milk and Kisses, in 1996. That album was still pretty successful, even if it leaves a lot of bad memories for the people who made it. While working on that album, the band broke up, which, given all that was happening between them, makes sense. It had just kind of run its course. After the breakup, Liz found a new musical love in Jeff Buckley. They had a short but passionate affair that resulted in a beautiful duet that was never commercially released but has become available now. They had broken up before Jeff's tragic passing. Liz has continued her solo career sporadically, releasing music and playing shows when she feels like it, but she seems content to be a little bit more out of the public eye as much as possible. Simon tried to get his own solo career going, and then he formed a group called Snowbird, but he's been off and on with his own career, working in film a bit and just kind of releasing music here and there. Robin, on the other hand, has had a pretty successful solo career, releasing a string of albums in the 2000s. Of course, there's been a lot of talk about a reunion, but honestly, I wouldn't hold your breath on that. They were scheduled to reunite in 2005 for Coachella, but Liz backed out because it was still too painful to think about sharing a stage with Robin again. It's rumored that they were each going to be paid $1.5 million for that performance, but according to Liz, money was never the point. It was set up by their former childhood friend turned manager who just wanted them all to be friends again. But Liz said that her bandmates were her entire life, and since she was in so deeply, she had to be out just as deeply. She had to completely remove herself. Robin, for his part, has talked about how he doesn't understand why people would even want a reunion and that it's best to leave Cocteau Twins in the past. He also got a bit defensive and said that it makes it sound like everything he's done since then doesn't matter. So that's the story of Cocteau Twins, a band that is beautifully hard to explain and just pioneers of shoegaze. They really helped push the style of music into the mainstream. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you're familiar with Cocteau Twins, if you enjoyed them, if you have memories or thoughts associated with them, if you've seen them play. Leave that in the comments below. It's always fun to read those comments. And like the video if you ended up liking it. Subscribe if you want more of this, or I'm trying to learn music history. Once again, I want to give a huge thank you to our members. It means a lot to me that you want to partner with this. It makes it really cool and special that there's this like community of people who actually really care about what I'm trying to do here. So thank you so much for that.